Okay, we're ready to start the game. So up to this point, I've been kind of jumping around, giving a general overview, explaining some of the iconography, how to interpret some of the different tables and charts. Now I'll go through the precise procedure of the game. And the first thing how the game starts is we will do an auction. This is technically part of the first stock round is the auction for these private companies. I'll cover the individual powers of the private companies at the very end. So now I'll just kind of cover the procedure of how it works. So the first thing you'll do is shuffle up these player tiles, and technically whoever gets this will be the first player. They'll get kind of the priority deal card that says they go first in the round, and then all the other players will sit clockwise around them and go in that order. So the option that a player has in the auction for the private companies, they can pass, or they can take the lowest value company. It'll always be here to the left because that's how we sorted it, and pay the printed price. So the player could pay 20 yen and take the Takamatsu E Railroad into their possession. This would come out of their starting capital. Now, when the lowest private company is purchased, it will trigger an auction on any other private company where there was a bid. But now there's no bids. So the first player can take the lowest company, so that would go in, and then normal rules would apply here. Or, instead of buying the lowest private company, they can put an intent to buy on an additional or a different private company. So if they were interested in the Mitsubishi Ferry, they would have to put a bid of 35. It always has to be 5 more than the printed value, so at least 35. So they would put $35 or 35 yen out of their supply here to show that they have an intent to buy the Mitsubishi Ferry. The next player could come and they could, again, buy the lowest. If they did, that would trigger the sale of any other company with a bid on it. So if they bought the lowest, Mitsubishi Ferry is the only other company with a bid on it, and since the second player, the 2-player, was the only one to put a bid, they would take it for the 35 yen that they put on. Instead, they could put a intention to bid on a different company. So let's go through this example again. So the start player did not want to purchase this. They are interested in this B private company. So there's 5 more than the stated value. The third player comes, they can buy this. They can put a bid here, an intention to buy here, or they could put it on another company. Let's say they're interested in this one, the Sumitomo Mines Railway. So they would have to put an intention to buy at least 5 higher, so 55 on this one. So now we've had 2 players, both put an intention to buy. Now the third player might come and say, you know what, I'm also interested in this one. So they could also put one, and it has to be at least 5 higher than this one. So they would have to put 60 here. So they would put 60 here. You'll have to come up with some way to indicate which player is doing these. There's no easy way to do it in the game. So now we've had 3 players take an action. This player indicated an intent to buy this one, and we've had 2 subsequent players indicate an intent to buy this one. Now the 4th player comes, they could put a intent to buy on some of these higher ones, but instead they're going to purchase the lowest one. So again, they get it for 20, which triggers the sale of all other private companies that have a bid on them. So here, there's only 1 player that put a bid of 35, 5 higher than that, so they would get that one. No auction. This one has 2 bids, so this would trigger an auction for this private company. So these 2 players are the only ones that have a stake in the auction. No other player can get in the auction. They're the only ones that put a bid. So they would go back and forth, and the winner would take that private company. The loser would take their cash back into their supply, and that would take that out. So that would now leave only these private companies remaining in the auction, and the normal rules apply. The next player could take this one for the printed value, or they could put an intent to buy on any of the higher ones, and it proceeds likewise. All money paid for private companies goes back to the bank, and play will proceed until all the private companies are purchased. You'll see there is a rule here that if all players pass during the initial stock round and this company has not been purchased because it's the lowest, its value will be reduced and then eventually it'll be forced to be purchased. But the remainder of the initial stock round really can't proceed until all the private companies are in players' hands. And just a quick note, there are typically 3 benefits to owning a private company. The first of which, it will pay revenue at the start of each operating round to its owner. So if a player owns it, this company would pay $5 of revenue at the start of every operating round. You can also, some companies can be sold to public corporations. You'll remember that starts when the first 3 train is purchased. Private corporations, some can be purchased by public corporations at a value between 1/2 or 2 times their value, and that revenue will get paid by the corporation into the player's hands. So that's the second benefit. And the third benefit that we'll cover at the very end is each private company has a special power or a restriction or some type of privilege that will give either the player or eventually the owning corporation. One final point about private companies, you'll remember that once the first 5 train is bought, all private companies close and they're removed from the game. All the powers or the restrictions that they once hold are now obsolete. There may be an exception to that, and it will be listed on the private power of the company. Once all the private companies have been sold, this round continues, so the next player to have taken an action now gets the option of buying the first certificate in the game. So technically, the auction of the privates is part of the very first stock round. There's also a restriction that in the first stock round, which we're now covering, you're not allowed to sell stock. You can only buy certificates. So during a stock round turn, a player can do one of 3 things. They can pass, which will then play will proceed clockwise. They can re-enter later if the auction is still going. If all players pass after them, that will end the auction, but they could pass. Or they could buy 1 certificate, and or they can sell multiple certificates, and they can do that in any order. So I could sell 5 certificates and then buy 1, or I can buy 1 and then sell multiple certificates. I can do that in any order, but you can only ever buy 1 on a stock turn, and you can sell multiple. Keep in mind, since this is the first stock round of the game, you are not allowed to sell, you can only buy. So there are 3 different ways that you could buy a certificate. You can buy the very first certificate of a company, which would be the president's share, or you could buy a certificate of a company that was already, a certificate was already purchased and a par price was set, or you could buy shares of corporations that are in the open market, and that'll only happen after some shares have been sold there. So to start the game, let's say that the first player wants to buy the president's certificate of the Coda Railway. So we know this represents 2 shares. The first decision they need to make is what do they want to set the par price or the initial offering of this stock at. And you are required to make some certain choices. You only have 6 par values to choose from. You could set it at 65, 70, 75, 80, 90, or 100. So based on what you set it at, that'll determine how much you pay for those 2 shares. So if you set the par price at 80, your 2 shares will cost 160 yen, and you'll pay that immediately for your president's share. A very important concept is determining the right par price, because you want this corporation to what we call float. It means initiate or be active being able to operate in the first operating round. And you'll remember that at least 50% of the shares have to be sold for the public corporation to operate. So some of what you're determining is, do I have enough money based on the par price that I set it at where I can at least purchase those 5 shares to get this railroad operating? So if I was to set the par price at 65, and I know it takes 5 shares to operate, 65 times 5 is 325, I would need at least 325 yen. So on subsequent rounds, or on subsequent turns of this first stock round, I can buy another share of Kododen, another share, and then finally a 5th additional share, and then the corporation would float and be ready to operate in the first operating round. So in this example, let's assume this player did get the Kododen. They set the par value at 65, so that means their 2 shares would have cost 130 yen. They pay that to the bank, and they take the president's certificate. Now it's the next player's turn. So they can make a decision. Do they want to buy the president's certificate and set the par price for that new corporation, or they can buy a share of the Kododen Railroad? When you're buying from the initial offering, the price is always the par value. It's always 65 because that's what the president set it as. So they could buy 1 share of this for 65, and then play would proceed clockwise. If at any point, as we're going round and round, another player purchased enough Kododen shares where they had more shares than the president, then the president would lose control of the company. That would be called a takeover. And so the president would have to exchange their president's shares for 2 regular shares, and then the president's share would be in the hands of another player, whoever controls the most shares in a company. The other way you could buy a share is, let's assume this wasn't the first stock round. Let's say we've had a couple stock rounds and players have sold shares into the open market. You can buy a share from the open market. In this case, you don't pay the par price. You would pay the current market price. So in this case, the company had been running very successfully, so it would not make sense to buy one of these shares for 125. You would still want to buy an available share in the initial offering of the company for the par price. But what if, for example, the company had not been running successfully and was way down here? Instead of having to pay the par price of 65, you could buy a share from the open market at the current stock price of 45 in this example. So to recap, for your buy action, you can buy 1 certificate. You can buy the president's certificate if nobody else has bought it and set the par price. You can buy a certificate from a company that has already been purchased at the existing par price, or you can buy a certificate from the market at the current stock price. One other consideration when determining the par price, when you buy the original president's certificate, is you're also determining how much capitalization that public corporation will start with. So once the corporation floats, once 50% of its shares, or 5 shares, have been purchased in 1889, the company will float and it will become fully capitalized. You will basically take the par price multiplied by 10. That's the total number of shares for every corporation. So in this case, you'll remember we set the par price at 65. So once the 5th share is bought, this corporation will become fully capitalized. 65 times 10, so 650 yen will come from the bank into the Kododen treasury. And those will be the funds that it has to operate. And you'll see it's listed right here. When floated, or 50% of its stock is purchased, it receives 100% of its capital. So par price times all 10 shares. So the benefit to a higher par price is it will receive more initial capital when it does float, and it will have a higher initial value in the stock exchange. The value to a lower par price is that it will be easier to start the company and float the company and get those 5 initial shares purchased, because every player is starting with limited funds and you may not be able to start a corporation in the first stock round. So if a company does float during a stock round, a couple things will happen. You will set another one of its markers within this red box here to indicate its current stock price. So since the par price was set at 65, it would go 65 in this box. You'll see these numbers correspond exactly to these. It has to be in this red area. And as we talked about earlier, if another corporation also floated in the same stock round, it would go underneath this token to indicate that this was floated first. So now the company is active on the stock exchange and can operate in the first operating round. The player who owns the majority share with the president's certificate would take the company charter, and again it would receive its full capitalization of cash, and it would be ready to operate in the first operating round. A couple other rules to point out when buying certificates before we move on to selling is you're always limited to your certificate limit based on the number of players in the game, and keep in mind that private companies count against this certificate, and regulations, you can always only hold a maximum of 6 shares of a single company. So once you have 6 shares of a single company, you cannot go over that amount. Keep in mind that if a company is operating and their stock value has entered into the yellow or the orange area, the rules change a little bit. Any company whose stock price is here, those certificates do not count against your limit. And then any company that's here, certificates do not count against the limit, and you can own more than 6 shares in a company. So you can break that rule if the company's operating all the way down here or has that value on the stock exchange. All right, we've covered buying. Let's cover selling. Remember, on your turn in a stock round, you can always buy 1 certificate or sell as many as you're able to or would like to. Keep in mind the first stock round you're not allowed to sell, but all subsequent stock rounds you can buy and or sell in any order. You can buy 1 and sell multiple. A couple rules. So when you sell certificates, you can sell any combination. You could sell certificates from different corporations that you own. The bank or the open market will only ever accept a maximum of 5 shares of a single corporation. So if you had 6 shares of a corporation, you could not sell all 6. Or if another player, let's say there were 4 shares of the Codaden Corporation in the market, you could only sell 1 additional share to the market because the bank is holding the maximum of 5 shares that it's allowed. When you sell your shares, you basically sell for the current price multiplied by all the shares you're selling. So if you were selling Codaden shares, let's say you were selling 2 shares of Codaden, you would sell those for 2 times 65 or 130. You would take that money from the bank into your private funds. Remember, this is the player that owns certificates, not the corporation. You would take that and then you would put those shares into the open market. When shares are sold, the stock price will drop based on the number of shares sold. So if I sold those 2 Codaden shares, it would drop twice. Keep in mind, you are not allowed to sell the president's share of a corporation unless another player can assume the presidency of a corporation, meaning that they would have to have owned 2 shares in the company. So if no other player owns 2 shares in a corporation, you are not allowed to sell your final 2 shares. You have to retain the presidency. If another player can take ownership of the corporation, you can sell your president's share, and then they would exchange, just like a takeover, they would exchange their 2 regular shares for your president's share. They would receive the president's share, their 2 shares would go into the open market for availability later, and they would assume ownership of that public corporation. So that's an important concept to remember to protect yourself from someone trying to dump a corporation that may have had its funds depleted or is in a bad position to purchase a railroad. One way to protect yourself is to never hold more than 1 share in a public corporation unless you're confident that it's being run successfully and you're safe. once you hold more than one, two or more, you are subject to a possible assumption of the presidency in that corporation. Another rule about selling stock is that once you've sold a share of a specific corporation, you can no longer buy shares of that corporation in that stock round. The next stock round, after operating rounds, you can buy shares in that company. So, since you can buy or sell on your turn, you could spend 3 subsequent turns buying a share of Codaden. And then on the third turn, you could sell all those shares and try to drop its stock value. Remember, if it was here, it could never drop below its floor. But once you did sell a share of a corporation, you're no longer allowed to buy that same corporation in that stock round. So you'll need some way to record that information so you don't forget. At the end of a stock round, and we'll talk about how a stock round ends, at the end of a stock round, if all the shares of a single corporation are in players' hands, means they're owned by the players, that value will go up 1 on the stock market. It won't count if they're owned by the bank, but if all shares have been purchased by players and it's sold out, then you increase that stock value 1 up on the stock market track. Once all players have passed, then that's the end of the stock market round. And the last player to have taken an action, either buying or selling a stock, the player to their left or clockwise receives the priority deal card, meaning that they'll go first in the next stock round, which would be a powerful position. So it's basically the next player that would have gone gets the priority deal card. So that's another thing to keep in mind. If you're the last player to take an action in the stock round and everyone after you passes, then you're going to go last in the next stock round. Because if you're the last one to take an action, the priority deal card passes to your left. They will go first in the next stock round, and it will go all the way around clockwise until it gets back to you, and you'll actually have the last action in the next stock round. So to recap the stock round will begin with the player with the priority deal, and then on a player's turn, they can buy 1 certificate and or sell multiple certificates. If they're buying a certificate, they can buy the president's share and set the par price, or they can buy a share of the initial offering of a company that already had the president's certificate bought and they paid the par price, or they can buy shares out of the open market for the current stock price. They can sell a number of shares. Shares times the current stock price equals their proceeds. The bank will only accept a maximum of 5 shares. The stock market will drop 1 space for each share sold. And a couple points to keep in mind. To protect your presidency, if you don't want another player to take it over, you have to at least hold 5 shares. If you had 4 shares, someone could accumulate 6. That's the maximum of shares in a company someone could hold, and they would take over the presidency share. Also, to protect you, be careful if you hold 2 or more shares in a company, because if the existing president sells their president's share and there's someone able to take it over, you would exchange for that president's share and you would become president of the company. If 2 other players have equal shares in the company, let's say 2 other players both have 2 shares, and I sell my president's share, it's the player next in clockwise order that would assume the presidency for that company. Once you sell a share of a public corporation in that same round, you can't buy shares of that corporation anymore. And keep in mind, if at any point 50% of the shares are purchased, that company would float and be ready to operate on the next operating round. And then finally, at the end of the stock round, you'll evaluate if any of the public corporation shares are fully owned by players. If so, their stock value will move up 1. And then the last player to take an action in the stock round the player to their left will receive the priority deal card to go first in the next round. So that covers everything for the stock round. Let's move on to how operating rounds work. All right, so let's cover the operating rounds now. So at the end of a stock round, we will move to complete a series of operating rounds based on the era of the game. So if we're still with 2 trains, we'll just complete 1 operating round. If we're in the green phase, we'll have 2 operating rounds. Or if we're in the brown phase, after the first 5 is bought, we'll have 3 operating rounds before each stock round. Always remember before each operating round to pay the private companies. So the private companies will pay revenue to their owners, either to a player into their personal cash or to a corporation if the corporation owns it. Remember, once the first 3 train is bought, a corporation during its operating round can purchase a private company from a player, anywhere from half its printed value to double its printed value. So they could pay anywhere between $10 and $40 for this specific private company, and that money would go to the player. That starts in after the first 3 train is purchased, and then once the 5 train is purchased, all the private companies close unless there's a specific exception with the company. Keep in mind that only active corporations will operate during the operating round, meaning that they had to have sold the minimum number of shares in 1889. That's 50% of their shares sold, and they would float, and they're active on the stock exchange. The order in which the public corporations operate is based on their stock value, from highest to lowest. So a company with a stock value of 70 would operate before a corporation with a stock value of 60. If they both share the same value, the corporation that's furthest to the right on the stock track would operate first, and then this corporation would operate. And as we mentioned, if they both floated in the same round, the one that floated first would operate first. A good best practice is after a corporation operates and completes their entire operating round to flip it over. And that'll help you keep track in terms of which corporations have operated and which ones haven't yet, and then go from descending stock order. And then also keep in mind it's the player that holds the president's share that gets to operate the railroad, the public corporation, during the operating round. So in an operating round, the railroad can do 4 things in this precise order. They can first lay or upgrade 1 track tile. Then they may buy a station token and place it in an available spot. Then they run their trains. And then finally, they can buy new trains. So those are the 4 things that they can do. They have to be performed in that order. The only other thing we talked about is they can buy a private company also during their operating round. So let's cover each of those in depth. So the first option is they can lay or upgrade a tile. And you'll remember they're restricted based on the era of the game. So until the first 3 train is bought, they can only lay or put tiles that are of the yellow variety. Once the 3 train is bought, they can do yellow and green. And then once the first 5 train is bought, they can do yellow, green, and brown. And tiles need to be upgraded in that progression. So let's take an example. Let's say we're operating the Kotodin Railroad. So the first thing you do with an active corporation is you lay its initial starting station in its starting spot. You'll remember that each corporation has a starting location. So Kotodin starts in Takamatsu, and that's this area of the board. And the initial station placement, that token would have actually come from here, is always free to place the initial station. Later we'll talk about having to pay to place additional stations. So that's where they start. And then their first action is they may lay a track tile. So since we're in the first era, they could extend off of their network. They basically have to lay a tile that can connect to their network, which includes one of their stations. They could build there, and that would just be a free tile placement. Laying tiles are free unless there's a terrain cost that they have to pay. So if they wanted to instead lay this one to connect to this off-board location, they could do that, but they would have to pay 80,000 yen premium, and that would come from the corporation's treasury. If they lay track that connects to a small town indicated by these black dots, they would have had to use one of the track tiles with these hash marks. So they could put that. That indicates that this was placed and it's moving through a town that can be serviced by a train. If on a later turn they're extending their network and they're building a tile or they're building track in a tile with a white circle, that indicates a city, and that has to be used with one of these. This also provides another spot to place a token for that network. If we were out of the yellow phase and we were able to place green track tile, you can always upgrade a tile instead of laying a new one. So they may decide to upgrade that yellow to this one. It has to maintain the existing connections, and they've just added some new connections. And then the value of connecting to this city has increased from 20 to 30. As we talked about before, you cannot upgrade a tile that leads track leading out into the sea, or leading into a permanent gray tile that doesn't have a track connecting from that angle. You could potentially also upgrade existing ones that are on the board. This yellow would go to a green. One thing to keep in mind is that upgrading this specific tile is restricted by this private company. One final concept about laying track is that all track is public. Other corporations can use track laid by previous corporations. There's nothing that says this link of track is owned by one corporation or another. Now, you will be able to get exclusive rights to service cities, potentially by putting tokens in here, but we'll talk about that next. So after the corporation lays or upgrades track, restricted by the era, they can decide whether to purchase and place a station token. Station tokens are limited based on the corporation. So here they had one station token that went to their starting area, and they've got one additional station token for the rest of the game that will cost 40 yen to place, and that comes out of the corporation's treasury. So they may decide both of these connect currently into their network, that they don't want to get boxed out of expanding this way. So they're going to pay the 40 out of their corporation, and they're going to pay that. Now what has happened is they have an exclusive right to do that. So if another company was moving into here, their network would be forced to stop at that city. They could still service the city and receive the revenue, but they could not pass through. You can only pass through cities that contain your token or an empty token. That just represents that the city has an open relationship with all corporations, allowing them all to pass through equally. Now later in the game, another corporation that connects into this city during their tile lay phase, since they connect to this tile, they may decide to upgrade it as long as they maintain all the existing links. That way it provides an extra station token so they can place one. The one that was here would automatically go there, but now an additional one is created. So station tokens act as blocking mechanisms in the game in terms of operating your rail network. So in the operating round, you can lay or upgrade a tile, you may place a station token, and then finally you get a chance to operate your trains if you have some. So let's use the very first operating round of the game as an example. So this corporation, as their first tile laid here, So they do have an active route here. They can connect into that city. But in order to run their trains, they have to run trains. And you'll remember they cannot buy trains until the fourth action during the operating round. So in the very first operating round of the game, nobody will be able to run trains. After you run your train and collect your revenue for the corporation, you get to make a decision. Do you retain all that revenue into the corporation's treasury, or do you pay dividends? If you decide not to pay dividends, or if you're unable, an example of the very first operating round, nobody can pay dividends because nobody ran trains, the stock market token moves one to the left on the stock market if you do not pay dividends. If you do pay dividends to your shareholders, you move one spot to the right. So in every operating round when the railroads run, everybody's stock market token will move either left or right, depending on whether they paid dividends or retained earnings. Okay, let's go back to running trains. So the number train determines how many different locations can be serviced by that train. So to start the game, a level 2 train could service 2 locations. It could service this city and this off-board location of Naruto and Awaji. If you wanted to service a third location, you would have to have a level 3 train. So I'm going to fast forward to the second operating round to show you a couple examples. So let's say in the first operating round, I laid this track. I was unable to run a route since I had no train, so I had to move back to the left on the stock market. But in the fourth phase of my operating round, I was able to buy trains. And let's say I bought 2 trains. I bought 2 level 2 trains for 80 yen each for 160 yen total. That money comes out of the corporation, goes to the bank. I take both those trains, and they would get added to the Kododen Corporation. Now, in a subsequent operating round, I get to the phase where I can lay tile. So I lay this tile on the second operating round. Actually, that's wrong. That's a city. This would require a town. So let's say I lay that. I decide not to pay for an additional station token, and now I'm ready to run my trains. So I have 2 level 2 trains. So we know a level 2 train can service 2 locations. So my first train will service this city and this off-board location. So this train would earn me 30 plus 20 for 50 total revenue. These revenues are for later phases in the game when we're in brown track phase or once we've entered the diesel phase. My second level 2 train can service these 2 locations, Takamatsu and this small town, for 30 plus 10 for 40. It's important to keep in mind that you cannot run over the same track when you run your train. So since I had one train running on this track, these 2 segments, they could service both these cities, and I could have another track service the same city as long as it's running on a different set of track. It's running on this track coming out of Takamatsu into this town. So those 2 level trains got me 30 plus 20, 50, plus another 30, 80, plus 10, 90. So my total running trains earned me $90 of revenue during the operating round. It's important that every single route must either start from, end, or move through one of your station tokens in order to be legitimate. And then at the end of running trains, the corporation has a big decision to make. They've earned $90 or 90 yen of revenue. If they decide to retain all those earnings, 90 would come to their company treasury for use in future rounds. They would move one space to the left on the stock market because they're upsetting shareholders by retaining earnings. Or they could instead pay dividends. Every shareholder would get 10% of the revenue earned. So since we earned 90 of revenue, every shareholder would get 9 yen per share owned. So let's say I own 5 shares in the Takamatsu Railway. I would get 9 yen times 5 shares. So I would earn 45 yen into my personal cash as a player. And any other player that owned a share of the of the Kododen Railroad would get $9 or 9 yen per share they owned. After you've made your decision to retain earnings or to pay dividends, the last thing you can do is buy trains. In this example, let's say all of the level 2 trains had been purchased. So the Kododen Railroad could now purchase the first level 3 railroad for 180 yen and place it into their treasury. That would trigger the phase to change. So now we could lay or upgrade yellows to greens. And we'd have 2 operating rounds in between stock rounds. But again, that wouldn't happen until we finished the existing. So we'd finish this one stock round, then it would get reset to there. But let's fast forward. Let's say they did purchase that 3, and on their next one, they build to this city. So now with a level 3 train, they could service this city, and this city. If they only had a level 2 train, they could only go here and here. They could not extend that train all the way to there. But now they've got a level 3 and 2 level 2s. Now, so with the level 3, they service this one, and this one for 30, 40, 60 of revenue. And the level 2 train, they can still service this one and this one for the additional 50. Now they have another level 2 train, but they can't use the same track twice. So they couldn't service this a second time. So that level 2, that extra level 2 train wouldn't be of any benefit this operating round. Here's one last example in the operating round. Let's say the Kododen Railroad had built this network or is the beneficiary of this network, and they had a level 5 train. With that one level 5 train, they could service this city, this town, this city, and this off-board location. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. As long as the route starts, ends, or moves through one of their station tokens, that would be one route. A diesel train can service an unlimited number of locations. Towns, cities, off-board locations, but can only service each one once. And then as we mentioned, if the company does pay earnings, their stock gets to move one space to the right. When paying dividends, you'll pay the dividend to all players that own shares. If there's any shares still left in the public offering, they wouldn't receive any money. They would just kind of be owned by the bank. So you get money from the bank from running your things. So when you earn this revenue, that money comes to the corporation from the bank, and then it gets either retained in your treasury or paid out. Now, if there were shares that got sold in the open market, you can see here it says shares in the open market pay dividends to the company. So if there were 2 shares in here and you're paying dividends to all shareholders, the money for these 2 shares, let's say it was $9 per share, would actually come to the company treasury. The last thing we want to talk about in the operating round, remember the final phase of the operating round, is you can buy trains. A corporation is required to buy a train if it has a legal route on the board, which in almost all cases it will. It's required to buy a train. So if, for example, someone bought the first 4 train earlier in the operating round and it rusted all of your 2 trains, you only had 2 trains, those immediately get discarded. when it gets to this corporation's turn in the operating round, they have no trains to operate, so they're going to have to move back on the stock chart, move one to the left, and then they're going to be forced to buy a train during that round. If they do not have the funds in their treasury to buy a train, the president of that company is obligated to use their personal funds to buy the cheapest train available. If they don't have the cash to do it, they're going to have to immediately sell stock to buy that train for the corporation. In fact, that's one of the main reasons, or one of the main reason that a player would go bankrupt in the game. There is one loophole. The corporation can buy a train from another corporation at any mutually agreed upon price, not less than $1 or not less than $1. So if you owned 2 railroads or 2 corporations, you could buy one train from another corporation if you were required to buy a train. Even if you weren't required, you can freely buy a train from another corporation during your operating round. And then you agree upon the price. The minimum price is $1. One thing to keep in mind is during your operating round, you're not allowed to sell a train. It's actually in the operating round that you can buy a train. So if it was Kodaden's operating round, I couldn't give a train to another corporation for money. That corporation would have to wait until its operating round to purchase a train from Kodaden if I was willing to make that arrangement. So it's very important to keep in mind how many trains are left for purchase in the market, and then what the consequences will be for your run corporations in terms of rusting the trains that you're using and then launching into the next phase. One other reminder is that as the eras change, each corporation will be limited to the number of trains that it can have. So if a corporation had 3 trains and the first 5 gets purchased, the limit is 2. All corporations must discard down to 2 trains. And those trains, assuming they're haven't been rusted, if they're still valid, would actually come into the bank pool, the open market. And if a train was forced to buy a train, they could purchase from these or maybe a lower level one from the open market. Once all corporations have completed their operating round, you'll either move to the next stock round or to another operating round based on the era in the game. And that is how the operating rounds work. As a quick reminder, corporations will start with the highest valued corporation going first to the least valued corporation. They do 4 things, or can do 4 things. The first thing is they have the option of laying or upgrading a track tile based on the era. They can place as an additional station token. Both those things take money out of the corporation's treasury. They then run their trains. If they have trains, they run their routes. They decide whether they retain the earnings or pay dividends to shareholders. And the final thing they can do is purchase trains, and they are required to purchase a train if they don't have one and they have an active route. And that's the operating round. Okay, let's cover each of the private companies and you'll be ready to start the game. So the Takamatsu E Railroad, it has no special abilities. It costs 20 yen. It's the lowest price one. It'll pay 5 revenue to its owner, either the player or the corporation, if it gets sold. Also remember that it restricts tile building on the city of Takamatsu. So as long as this private company is held by a player, no corporation could upgrade Takamatsu until this gets closed or sold to a corporation. The Mitsubishi Ferry, the player owner may place this special port tile, it's a special tile, on one of the coastal village towns, and there's 4 of them. Nakamura, Nangoku, Uki, and Komatsujima. Now, this player doesn't have to have a corporation that's connected to those. They can do it out of turn during the operating round. Again, it'll pay 5 revenue to the player or the corporation when sold. And keep in mind, both these can be sold to corporations for 1/2 to double the stated purchase price or the stated value. The Ehime Railway, when this company is sold to a corporation, the selling player may place a green tile, any green tile. There's not a special green tile on the city of Ozu. So you can immediately upgrade Ozu from yellow to green using a green tile from the supply. Its printed price is 40, and it gives 10 revenue to the owning player or corporation. The Sumitomo Mines, the owning corporation may ignore building costs to mountain hexes. So you remember, if a corporation is building track, they've got to pay an additional 80 out of their treasury. If a player sold the Sumitomo Mines to a corporation, they can ignore that. Also, when you sell it, it does not close the company. So the company what that means is the company stays open and you'll continue to get that revenue each round. Companies only close if this says they close, or when the first 5 train is bought, then all private companies close, all their power goes away, all their restrictions go away. The Dugo Railway, the owning player may exchange this private company for a 10% share of the EO Railway in the initial offering. So during the stock round, whoever owns this can say, I'm going to play this, and then trade this away. So they couldn't sell it to a corporation, unfortunately, but they trade this away and instantly get a share of the EO Railway. The South EO Railway has no special abilities. Cost 80, but you get 20 revenue. Remember, at the start of every operating round, either to the player or the owning corporation. And then finally, the Uno Takamatsu Ferry. This does not close while owned by a player. I just mentioned that all private companies will close when the first 5 train is purchased, except this one. This will not close. After the purchase of the first 5 train, revenue becomes 50 yen instead of 30 yen. So it's very expensive. It's the most expensive private company. It'll pay 30 revenue per operating round. And then once the first 5 train is purchased, this is the only private company in 1889 that won't close. It'll stay open and continue to pay revenue for the remainder of the game. So those are the private companies, and that should be everything you need to set up and play 1889.